The interesting thing about Mickey Mouse as a character who's nearly a century old and has been in regular use more or less all of that time, is that every generation has their own impression of who Mickey is, one that's informed by how he's evolved over the decades. For those who were present for his original misadventures in the 20s and 30s, Mickey was genuinely audacious, breaking from the stiffer attitudes of the era. He was mischievous, brash, and occasionally petty or jealous, but he was also an underdog with a happy-go-lucky attitude that charmed audiences. However, as his popularity and that of Disney overall grew, that slight edge he had was softened, and any sense of self-interest was replaced with a heart of gold as he became a role model for children and, moreover, the face of the House of Mouse. He transitioned from a genuine character with flaws and conflicts to an idealized mascot, a smiling, trustworthy face to represent all of the myriad things Disney as a whole was doing. But ironically, in becoming the symbol of the company, it meant Mickey himself was used less and less in any sort of proper stories. Sure, he was on t-shirts and lunchboxes and tatty bits of plastic galore, but actual cartoons, shows, movies? We saw Mickey in those less and less, as Disney couldn't risk impacting his sacrosanct corporate-approved image in any way. By the time we get to the era I was born in, and most of you were going off my analytics, Mickey has become so underutilized and so sterile that he's become boring. Milquetoast, the least interesting thing Disney has on offer for the children of the 80s and 90s. He still shows up here and there, but more often than not, he's playing another character. He's not allowed to be Mickey, and even those performances adhere to such safe guidelines. The only inkling someone of my generation might have had that there was more to the character would have been from some of the compilations of old shorts that Disney was putting out on VHS and cable at the time, but those releases were an afterthought compared to the deluge of more contemporary media that the Disney Renaissance put on people's shelves. Once we hit the millennium and the years that followed, Mickey has become nothing more than a logo, just 3 intersecting black circles stamped on anything the company makes. There are still some attempts to look back on the old shorts and introduce them to new audiences around this time, but for the most part, anything Mickey features in at this point is safe, comfortable pablum, made for children so young they can barely say his name. He's reduced to simply a smile attached to a soothing melody and a rush of bright primary colors, which, as a parent, I will say certainly serves a purpose, but is a far cry from his pioneering early days. And then, seemingly out of nowhere, in the 2010s, Mickey was redefined and allowed to once again be an actual character, one with his own idiosyncrasies and potential for actual humor. That's because starting in 2013 and running through to 2023, we got a slew of shorts and specials helmed by Paul Rudish, a legend in the world of animation known for his work alongside Genndy Tartakovsky on stuff like Dexter's Lab, the Powerpuff Girls, and even Batman the Animated Series way back in the day. These works brought Mickey back to the forefront, putting forth a version of the character that was still the eternal good guy, but now to a fault. Being naive, a little narcissistic, and a major dork. Always eager to help, but blithely ignoring the circumstances, creating actual conflicts for stories to happen around. Rudish's shorts revitalized Mickey, and finally broke him out of the prison of just being a mascot. But the seeds for that revelation were actually laid years earlier. Disney as a company was well aware that their flagship character had been left on the altar to languish, and they wanted to do more with him and allow him to step outside of the corporate safeguards that they themselves had set up. Which is why, before the wonderful world of Mickey Mouse, we got Epic Mickey. Now, before we get into the nitty-gritty of Disney's forlorn and forgotten video game attempt to give their pet mouse some teeth, I do want to give a quick disclaimer, just in case that intro gave some of you the wrong idea. For those of you who are new here or otherwise unaware, I cover video games on this channel, not politics or the culture war or any of that. While I'm well aware that there is a vault full of controversial subject matter to discuss when it comes to Disney as a company and the people attached to it, that's not what we're here to talk about today. We are here to cover Epic Mickey as a game, and discuss its origins, which will involve talking about Walt Disney, Bob Iger, and Disney corporate policy to some degree, but only really to give context for the story of this game and the story in this game. I'm making a point to bring this up now and clear the air, because Disney is one of those subjects that people can be exceedingly passionate about, in both directions. If you're looking for a weepy love letter to the company, or a spittle-flecked teardown of their practices, then click away now. After all, there are dozens of other channels here on YouTube that will happily serve those needs for you. That said, if you are interested in learning how this game came to be and how it holds up after all of these years, then grab some popcorn, get cozy, and settle in as we go over the birth of Epic Mickey. With that unpleasant business out of the way, our story begins back in 2003, when a group of interns at Buena Vista Games, Disney's in-house gaming label at the time, came up with the core ideas for Epic Mickey. Despite its darker tone, it was well received internally, and even pitched to Bob Iger, who was the COO of the entire Disney company at that point. And he reportedly loved it, as remember, there was a recognition at the company and among the higher-ups that Mickey had become stale and was nearing irrelevance. However, as it stood, it was impossible to make the game, because its concept revolved entirely around one elusive little lagomorph, Oswald the Lucky Rabbit. Oswald was the first character that Disney ever created way back in the 1920s, when they were basically just two guys in a shack, specifically Walt and Ub Iwerks. Because they had no capital themselves, they had to have their work produced and distributed by other parties, specifically Universal Pictures and producer Charles Mintz. After so many years of this though, and 27 successful Oswald shorts, the Disney company had grown to the point where it no longer had to be the bottom of the totem pole in this arrangement. Emboldened, Walt went to New York to renegotiate things with Mintz, and not only did that discussion disastrously fall apart, but he also learned that as part of Mintz's dealings, Universal apparently owned the IP rights for Oswald. Furious to lose his first ink son, Walt angrily and apocryphally drew the first sketches of Mickey Mouse on the train ride home. And the rest is history. Getting back to the new millennium though, in October of 2005, Bob Iger is promoted to the CEO of Disney, and he hadn't forgotten that pitch from 3 years earlier. As such, as part of his new mandate, he sets out both the reinvigoration of Mickey Mouse as a character and the return of Oswald to the Disney stable as key goals. And he would have the opportunity to achieve the latter just a few months later. That's because around this same time, Monday Night Football moved from Disney-owned ABC to ESPN, and as part of that, John Madden moved over to Universal-owned NBC. His partner, though, veteran sportscaster Al Michaels, had signed a contract extension with Disney just a few years earlier, and he was locked in at ABC as a result. Publicly, all parties were fine with this arrangement, but there was speculation that Al might move to NBC as well, and it was clear that's where it made sense for him to be. Striking while the iron was white hot, Disney promptly made a deal with Universal, and in February of 2006 released Michaels from his contract so he could go to NBC, and in exchange, they got back the rights to Oswald and all of his old shorts. Funnily enough, Oswald himself and several of those old shorts are now public domain as of a couple of years ago. But I'm sure Al's contract extension would have run out well before that point, so it all likely still made good business sense. With Oswald now safely back in company hands, the path was clear for them to start making the game. But they needed a studio to actually put it together, as Buena Vista was on the ideas and publishing side of things, not development. Being Disney, this problem was solved with an acquisition, and Buena Vista Games, by this point rebranded to Disney Interactive Studios, bought the fledgling Junction Point Studios in July of 2007, with the explicit purpose of having them build Epic Mickey. Now, fledgling is perhaps a bit of a misnomer when it comes to Junction Point, because while they didn't technically have any published titles to their name when they were acquired, the studio was formed out of Ion Storm Austin refugees, and was headed up by the creator of Deus Ex, Warren Spector. As such, the studio had a hefty amount of veteran talent and industry cachet, to the point that prior to them being acquired by Disney, they were actually working on a Half-Life project for Valve. Supposedly, it was a spin-off focusing on Ravenholm, which Valve ended up canceling, then later handing off to Arcane, pre-Bethesda, and then canceling it again. That's a whole other story for another time, though, and what matters is that once Junction Point was off of that project, they were quickly snapped up by Disney and put to work on Mickey and Oswald's grim and gritty reunion special. As I alluded to earlier, a key aspect of that original pitch was that the game would have a darker tone, taking place in a twisted, mirror version of Disneyland, one inhabited by the forgotten cartoon characters of decades past, now being ruled over by Oswald. When it came to how twisted this world should be, supposedly Warren and his team were told to go wild. But not being his first rodeo, Spector knew it was best to figure out what the actual limits were, which leads us to the infamous concept art leak. In July of 2009, a number of images for the game slipped out, showing grotesque animatronic monstrosities with mawkish, smiling familiar faces, and landscapes depicting a blasted wasteland constructed out of discarded and decrepit Mickey merchandise. People were simultaneously aghast and alight that these could be from an official Disney project. And the reality was that they really weren't. All of these fantastically gruesome images were just scouts of a sort. They were explicitly drawn to be as over the top as possible, with the knowledge that corporate would most certainly reject them. But in the process, that back and forth of bureaucracy would help define what the line of acceptability actually was, so that Junction Point could spec things out properly. Naturally, Disney quickly rolled out Spector to say as much, and booked a big spread with Game Informer to reveal the game properly and try to get a hold of the narrative. But unfortunately, a lot of people's expectations were already set thanks to those original hauntingly interesting images. And even more unfortunate, the team didn't really have the budget or time to make any major adjustments in response to all this hype this late in development, especially as the game had already seen one major revamp. That's because Epic Mickey was initially envisioned as a regular multi-platform title, but in 2008, when they started work on the Wii version, the decision was made to rebuild it as an exclusive for Nintendo's massively popular White Rhombus. With the Media Machine now in full swing thanks to the leak, and the brakes being a bit loose thanks to them having to announce things on the back foot, the pressure was now on to get the game finished. This then leads to a further year of presumably harried development. I imagine with Papa Disney watching them like a hawk to ensure the rest of this project that's been nearly a decade in the making goes to plan. All of this effort then culminates with Epic Mickey launching in November of 2010, where it debuts to moderate success. Fighting against heavy hitters like Fallout New Vegas and Call of Duty Black Ops, it didn't exactly bust its way to the top of the sales charts, and the critical response for it was very middle of the road. Even so, it did still end up selling a respectable 1.3 million copies in that first month, which was enough in Disney's eyes to warrant a sequel and a 3DS spin-off, but it's clear this was not the big splash anyone was hoping for out of a project with this much legacy behind it. That's why, rather than it being regarded as either a Disney classic or a gaming treasure, it was quietly sent back to the vault, making it the perfect title for us to dig into all of these years later. And on that note, without further ado, let's put brush to canvas and dive in to Epic Mickey. Our story begins with Mickey waking up one night and, guided by some strange intuition, slipping through his bedroom mirror and into the atelier of Yen Sid, the wizard from Fantasia and familiar face to any Kingdom Hearts fan. Mickey stealthily watches the old man, who's working on an intricately detailed diorama of some very familiar-looking scenery, before the old sage then retires to his quarters, unaware of the mouse's presence. Curiosity getting the better of him, Mickey then goes to investigate the desk, where using the wizard's magic brush, he paints up a goopy copy of himself. His doppelganger quickly grows in size, though, and begins to corrupt and malform, getting wildly out of control. Mickey hurriedly tries to stop it by wiping it away, but in the process he spills paint and thinner all over the tableau, destroying the scene. There's no time for him to notice the damage he's caused, though, as a light turns on upstairs and he quickly tries to clean it up, unknowingly allowing the foul creature he created to seep into the diorama, before he quickly escapes back out the mirror. He returns to sleep, and we then see 80-odd years of pleasant nights fly by in this small room, getting glimpses of Mickey's whole career up to that point, with nods to his classic adventures and all the love and adulation he's enjoyed. Eventually, though, the past comes back to haunt him, and his peaceful sleep is interrupted as a pair of massive inky arms slip through the mirror to drag him back to Yensid's desk and into the model he destroyed all those years ago. He tears through the skies of this forgotten world, engulfed by the inky specter, before he crashes into a twisted version of Sleeping Beauty's castle, left unconscious on the floor as his kidnapper, a force known as the Shadow Blot, releases him and flies away. That is where the intro movie leaves us, and upon starting a new game, Mickey wakes up, still in the castle, but now strapped to a table and confronted by a mad scientist, or rather a mad doctor. The mad doctor, in fact. The Doctor gives us a classic villainous cackle and activates the monstrous device looming above Mickey, while the Blot circles overhead and Oswald sneaks into the room to observe the proceedings. The machine then does a bit of shtick, swapping between horrific implements of torture, before finally trying to plunge out Mickey's heart. Mickey manages to resist though, breaking free and sending the shithouse scepter flying back at the Doctor. The Blot tries to come to his defense, but is seemingly scared away when Mickey picks up the wizard's paintbrush, which fell in with him. Without a defender, the Mad Doctor beats a swift retreat through a convenient trapdoor, with Oswald trying to follow after him, but breaking the machine in the process, sending it into a rage and leaving Mickey to fend it off, as the game begins in earnest. Quickly dropping you into a boss fight of sorts, you're immediately aided by a friendly gremlin named Gus, who appears completely out of nowhere for reasons that are never explained, and will be attached to us at the hip for the rest of the game. I presume he came dashing in to help because he felt that in doing so, he could pursue his true passions, inundating people with blithely written tutorials, and making strange crackly noises via the Wiimote's speaker. Accordingly, your first interaction is him calmly telling you to jump around the arena to the different control consoles to do what any person playing a Wii does best: waggle. Shaking the remote will let Mickey do a spin move, which is mostly used for environmental interactions, activating switches or gears, and knocking back enemies. Thankfully, the maddening robotic eye is far more visually intimidating than anything else, and after some light platforming and further waggling, its circuits are fried, and Mickey and Gus are free to carry on through the castle. As they do, they chat a bit about the Blot, and also about the magic brush that Mickey has brought in with him. It seems that it has the powers of both paint and thinner, allowing us to create and destroy as we please, or at least as much as the level design will allow. That's because as we proceed through the castle and the rest of this ruined world known as the Wasteland, we'll see plenty of ghostly intangible outlines, as well as bits of the world that are unusually bright and colorful, and those pieces can be filled in or wiped away as we please. This dynamic between paint and thinner is the core hook of the game mechanically, and will be key to progressing forward, helping reveal scads of secrets lurking about, and just generally making the Wasteland a better or worse place depending on your preference. These powers are also central to the combat in this game, but I'll touch on that more later. One last wrinkle that's brought up during this initial conversation, though, is the fact that Mickey is now leaking, in a way. It seems that his tussle with the Blot has had some lingering side effects, and Mickey now has little motes of ink constantly floating off of him. It's an ominous sign to be sure, but nothing that can be dealt with right now, so we continue onwards, getting to grips with the basics of the combat and the platforming, and doing some very light puzzle solving as we pass through the courtyard and eventually escape the castle via a projector screen playing an old Mickey cartoon, a sight to which we'll become very well accustomed. These projector screens all lead to short little 2D platforming interludes that separate out the various parts of the game. In a nice hit of nostalgia, they're all based on classic Disney cartoons, primarily shorts starring Mickey Mouse, and they're all incredibly reverent to that source material in their design. While they may only last a minute or so apiece, each one is crammed with nods to the celluloid originals, with every hazard and gimmick being ripped straight out of the cartoon that level was based on. Even the very short flow of these levels generally follows the loose narrative of those shorts, and seeing such ancient pieces of Disney history reinterpreted in such creative ways is a major highlight of Epic Mickey. Now that being said, they're not super fun to play, necessarily. The base platforming already has its limitations, for reasons I'll discuss in a bit, but it's more slippery in these 2D stages. It's not unplayable, mind you, for as creative as these bits are, they're also very simply designed, so they rarely ask all that much of you, and they're quite short, so any frustration is sorted quickly. The issue is that the less than pleasant platforming can make these stages feel slapdash at times, and there are a few moments here and there where the level design feels distinctly unpolished, especially where the collectible reels that you can find in each stage are concerned. Funnily enough, despite being a Wii exclusive, what these bits remind me of most is Little Big Planet. The platforming is loose in a similar sort of way, and the layout of these levels reminds me a lot of the very straightforward stuff that people used to make in that game. Hell, even a lot of the assets used here have a distinct LBP vibe to them, with many of the set pieces being carved out of raw, flat polygons with decals slapped on top, which creates more of an impression of what they were trying to model than anything else. At the end of the day, it does the job though, and that developmental simplicity is very much excused by the level of detail paid to the source material and the quality of the work overall. But it is still apparent, and is one of the opening signs of some of the rough edges that this game has, though we'll see plenty more of those as we carry on through the Wasteland. The projector spits us out into a derelict section of the park where we can spy malfunctioning versions of the teacups, the Dumbo flyers, and the entrance to Disneyland's most infamous attraction, It's a Small World, which is shortened to just Small World here in the Wasteland. Out front, we find another gremlin which is trapped in the ticket booth by a number of blotlings, little puddles of the shadow blot that have come loose and taken shape, wreaking havoc all over the Wasteland. These inky annoyances make up roughly half the enemy roster, and come in a variety of flavors. We already saw the spotters earlier, which alert nearby foes and then menacingly roll at you once you've been spotted, and here we see some splatters, which are the main infantry of the blotling forces. Naturally, Mickey's got to clear them out if we want to save that gremlin and get the ride running again, so now's as good a time as any to go over the basics of combat in this game. The main hook for how fighting works here is the same as everything else: paint and thinner. That's because by and large, enemies cannot be defeated through other means. While you can waggle away at them if they get too close and have Mickey do a spin move to knock them back, they're just gonna keep coming until you pour a sufficient amount of art supplies down their throats. Using paint will induce what I assume is some sort of toxic delirium, and they'll bliss out and become your ally, even attacking other foes on Mickey's behalf. Thinner, on the other hand, caustic chemical varnish that it is, will cause them to melt away entirely, removing that enemy from play. If you're going full paint, it often means that combat encounters are balanced but extended affairs. Tough at first as you wololo your first converts and try to keep them converted, as any thinner will break the spell, but increasingly easier to handle as your new army helps turn the tide. Choosing to go all out thinner instead leads to much faster fights, but also often more dangerous ones. Not only do you forgo making friends to watch your back, something that's greatly appreciated when dealing with the janky camera and overall weak kludge, but spraying thinner everywhere can lead to you destroying things you didn't mean to, like the floor you're standing on. As the game strongly encourages you to pick a side and be either a paladin painter or thinning tyrant, this means that both styles of play are viable, and there's a fun balance between them, leaving room for experimentation and temptation to switch strategies in a tight situation. As for how Epic Mickey pushes you off the fence, well, there is a bunch of moral choice stuff we'll discuss later, but in combat it does that with the aid of guardian spirits. Over time, as you continuously either paint or thin the world around you, Mickey will start to build up a charge of sorts, and attract these little sprites to his side called tints and terps that are aligned with whatever liquid you've been spraying around the place. You can hold up to 3 of them at a time, and they can be spent in a couple of ways. On the one hand, they can be used to create a guiding light that helps point the way to any nearby objective, and on the other, they can be fired off at an enemy, giving you an instant fast pass to sort out most regular foes. If you've got a full set, then you can even fire off the whole hued horde at once, instantly dealing with 3 foes in a single volley. Given most fights only have you facing a handful of blotlings in the first place, this can really turn the tide in a tricky encounter. The rub, though, is that all of your sprites are either going to be paint or thinner. You can't mix them. And when you start using the alternate element, your charge starts flowing in the opposite direction, and you'll start to lose guardians as it yo-yos back and forth. As such, to ensure you've got a full set as often as possible, it makes sense to choose either paint or thinner and stick with it. That being said, I rarely found the combat so difficult or my exploration so stymied that I needed to use the Guardian Spirits. So keeping a full set around is more for peace of mind than anything else, and you could largely ignore them and play a narratively unsatisfying morally grey run if you absolutely must. Anyways, with an artistic bit of battering, we save the gremlin in the ticket booth, and in gratitude, he gets the ride boats sailing again, and we can set forth into this corrupted version of every parent's musical nightmare. And it is a faithful representation, with appropriately themed areas featuring some perhaps questionable enemy costuming, especially by modern standards, but hey, that was often true of the real ride as well, so points for staying true to the source material. Just like the real world that the ride is a caricature of, though, things are less than smooth, and there are various problems Mickey must sort through as he makes his way down the river, giving us our first real taste of what the Epic Mickey flow is like, and how it's laid out as a platformer. Level design overall in this game is generally quite linear, but it's also wide, with you moving from area to area in a set progression, but with lots of nooks and crannies to explore, and often a couple different ways to go about getting to that next part of the level. And like the combat, that design likes to play to different mentalities. If you want to barrel forward and not bother digging around for collectibles, you absolutely can. But that golden path will hold tougher or more extended platforming and combat sections, which might be what you want anyways. On the other hand, if you're the sort to thoroughly poke into every corner and muck around with solving light puzzles, then you'll be rewarded. Not only with all sorts of gubbins, but also by uncovering more trapped gremlins, who upon being freed will help mitigate some upcoming hazard or unblock a path. There's a great example of this dichotomy early on in this level, where at the end of the jungle section of the ride, there's a trickily positioned ambush of several blotling brooms called sweepers waiting for you. You can easily bounce through the area in just a couple of minutes and then take them on mano-a-mano. But if you explore the bridges and side rooms adorning the river, you'll free 3 gremlins who will dump the sweepers into the thinner for you, as well as clear the path to a collectible you otherwise wouldn't be able to reach. The choice is yours, and most of Epic Mickey is designed in this way, often with a good amount more complexity. This provides some nuance to the exploration and offers some much needed variance to a second playthrough, which, again with that whole paint thinner split, is encouraged. As for the actual platforming itself you'll perform in doing this exploration, it's clunky but consistent, and enjoyable enough for the most part. While Mickey doesn't leap quite as high or move quite as fast as it feels like he maybe should, his jump arc and timing is reliable at the very least, so you confidently know what you're going to get whenever you hit the A button. He does also have a decent enough double jump to help correct for mistakes, and he will ledge grab more or less everything it feels like he should, even from a very high drop. It's not as complete a moveset as other platformers have, even those from the time, and he's not as responsive as you'd expect either, but it all does the job well enough, and the level design mostly feels built with those limitations in mind. Every place it looks like you can reach with a bit of skill, and there's enough solid design on display to make exercising those reflexes enjoyable. There are some points later on in the game where it does feel like the controls struggle to meet the demands being made of them, but for the most part a balance is maintained. and you'll be able to enjoy the sludgy but serviceable platforming. Platforming that allows Mickey to work his way across the various globally themed plywood facsimiles on his way to the center of Small World, where there's a gremlin village he can stop at to get his bearings. On the way, though, he'll meet another resident of the ride, Pete, wearing a dress, or Small Pete as he's known, which perhaps carries some implications. He's here to give us our first proper side quest, as he's actually friendly with those gremlins we're gonna go meet, or rather he was. They're currently a bit pissed at him after he crashed his steamboat into their village while he was doing some Tony Hawk shit with it or something. They refuse to believe it was an accident or that he's sorry, but he says his ship's log will exonerate him, so he asks you to go grab it for him and clear his name while you're there. How you choose to deal with this semi-optional side quest will affect the path forward though, and it's your first introduction to some of the branching moral paths in this game. Though I'll get into those in more depth once we're back out into the park proper and have met a few more recognizable faces. In the meantime, Mickey's visit to the Gremlin Village is relatively uneventful. If you're walking the paint path like I was, it's an opportunity to fix up some leaky pipes, gussy up Gus's house, and of course grab Pete's logbook. Most crucially, you'll also climb to the top of the local clock tower, though it's not the clock tower, and deal with the ride pump at the top. In yet another aspect of Epic Mickey's fluid-based moral system, you'll come across these pumps from time to time when you're in ride-themed areas of the game, and they can be filled with either paint or thinner. The former will generally fix what problems are ailing the ride, and the latter will muck it up further. Mechanically though, both options will always just unlock the path forward, and which liquid you choose to use is more for flavor and scoring some extra good guy or bad guy points. The same is true here, and without much delay you'll unlock the path forward to the European area and the final push through Small World. It's here that we catch sight of Oswald again, who's running off ahead of us. Mickey will give chase, but the Colosseum is in the way, and this is where those chickens will come home to roost regarding Small Pete's logbook. If you took the time to recover his notes and showed it to the Gremlin Village Chief, then Pete will be grateful, opening the path forward as well as unlocking a treasure room for you. However, if you chose to ignore his request or handed the logbook over to the first gremlin who asked for it so we could have some bathroom reading, Pete will instead stick a big group of bluntlings on you, which you'll have to defeat before you can proceed. Whether you make it through peacefully or not though, after pushing forward through the Colosseum, you'll be face to face with the first actual boss fight in Epic Mickey, the Small World Clock Tower. Shocking absolutely no one, all of the bosses in this game can be defeated in two ways, using or at least representing either, say it with me now, paint or thinner. As mentioned, for my main run of this game, I did decide to lean into paint overall, so that's what you'll be seeing in my footage, though I'll make sure to comment on what the thinner path looks like. Not that there's a huge difference in approach between the two, at least when it comes to the clock tower. For a paint run, you'll be coloring up his arms in order to sway the towering titan's limbs to your side, with the trick being that you have to try to get them both fully filled in at roughly the same time, so that the spell doesn't wear off before they can make a bridge for you to go put a smile on his face. A thinner run works a bit differently, but follows the same idea, except now you'll be dissolving the armor surrounding his arms so that when he slams them down to hurt you, they'll break apart, eventually busting off entirely. Either way, you'll douse the tower's arms down with your substance of choice until that damn song finally stops, at which point you'll be rewarded with a capacity upgrade to your preferred reserve, and the way forward to another projector will open up so you can get to the game's main hub, Mean Street. With the Wasteland being built by Oswald to be as close to its real-life counterpart as possible, barring a few minor alterations, Mean Street fills the same role as Main Street does in Disneyland, acting as the gateway to the rest of the park, with projectors set up to let you access the various themed lands dotting the horizon. Oswald, as it happens, was last seen heading through the gate to one of those lands, OsTown, but apparently he pulled the plug on the way in, as the generator keeping the show going at the Penny Arcade has since shut down. Naturally, one of the gremlins will happily repair it for us, but we're gonna need to secure some missing gears and a power spark for him first. We'll find those around town, so this is as good a time as any to make the rounds and meet the residents. In doing so, we'll see plenty of sepia-toned toons wandering about, and that's because this place was built to be a refuge for all of the cartoon characters who have become forgotten and ignored. Curiously, this also includes bygone variants of characters, which is why not long after arriving on Mean Street, we meet another Pete. This time, the classic peg-leg flavor of Big Bad Pete. He acts as the de facto sheriff of Mean Street and keeps an eye on the town. We'll also meet up with Horace Horsecollar, an old member of the Silly Symphony Ensemble who didn't make the cut past the 40s, who's here as well working as a private investigator. Both he and Pete will give you regular side quests, and in fact, if you were helpful to Small Pete earlier, you'll already be in Big Pete's good books, and he'll have a special pin for you. Which, on that note, I should talk about those pins, as well as the collectibles and economy at large. Starting with those pointy bits of memorabilia, those being a popular souvenir at the real park, they are the main thing this game has to reward you with. They can be found hiding in the trickiest of secrets, are the reward for doing many of the more involved side quests, and often have moral variants to encourage multiple playthroughs. Unfortunately though, they do absolutely nothing. Acting is just an analog for achievements, collecting these pins doesn't grant anything of material value. They don't provide upgrades, they don't unlock content, there's not even a nice display for them as they're dug into the menus. They're literally just for completionist's sake. Aside from those pins, you'll also find concept art dotted around the world, and a film reel in each of the 2D stages. The concept art is self-explanatory, but given the importance of concept art to the history of the project as a whole, it's a cool thing to add. Though the wilder pieces that were leaked are unsurprisingly not included, as they don't fit the actual end tone of the game. The film reels, on the other hand, can be returned to the theater on Mean Street, and you'll receive various rewards as you keep handing them in. This includes new power sparks, pins, and even a few upgrades, which make them the only collectible worth really going out on a limb for. The rewards for these even include unlocking a couple of classic shorts to watch in the extras menu, which in a time before Disney Plus was actually a pretty cool bonus to have. Personally, I think it would have made more sense to tie this sort of milestone-based rewards progression to the pins instead, especially given how prominent they are for Disney diehards, but it's been 15 years, what's done is done. In addition to all these various tchotchkes though, the other thing you'll be picking up by the ton are e-tickets, another deep-cut reference to Disneyland history and the Wasteland's currency of choice. Sadly, the economy here is pretty underbaked, and there's not really much to buy with all the tickets you'll be collecting. Occasionally, characters might ask you for a few in order to perform some service for you, but it's generally such a nominal amount that it barely dents your wallet. And beyond that, there are a few shops, but they have very little worth actually buying in them. You can pick up some extra pins and concept art, which, as we've covered, don't really do anything. You can shore up on power sparks if you don't feel like doing side quests, though as long as you're not beelining the end of the game, you'll likely have more than enough. And there's the option to spend some cash to top up your reserves of paint, thinner, and health, which would be useful, if those things didn't spill out of every random bit of trash you ran into. Aside from that dubious bounty, there are also a very limited number of upgrades you can buy. One that will give you an extra health pip, a few that will bolster the number of sketches you can carry, which is a mechanic we'll talk about later, and one which will increase the size of your e-ticket wallet. That last one's actually the first you're likely to buy, and you'll need it, because you're certainly not going to be spending them fast enough otherwise to not hit the paltry opening cap. Something we can't buy in the shops, though, are those gears we need to get the projectors up and running. For those, we'll need to do some chores for Horace and Pete, setting the tone for how all the side stuff ends up working in this game, which, to put it bluntly, I hope you like fetch quests, because that's what 90% of your non-critical path experience will be. You'll meet a character, they'll ask for you to go get a thing or talk to somebody, you find said thing or talk to said person, and then you repeat that process until you've pulled out enough of your hair to recreate Mickey's Vegeta-ass looking widow's peak. Sometimes there will be the shallowest of curveballs thrown in, like doing a quick time trial, painting in footsteps to catch a crook, or, like with Small Pete earlier, there being a different way to complete the quest that better suits your moral alignment. That said, it all still largely boils down to being a bevy of very boringly designed busy work. Nothing more than filler to fluff up what is otherwise a potentially rather light experience. That's especially obvious when you realize that much of this content will have you trucking back and forth between the 4 hub areas you can visit, and that's because in order to move between them, you'll have to do the same 2D levels over and over and over again. These interstitial stages cannot be skipped, and while they are short, generally no more than a couple of minutes, they are just long enough to be annoying when you're forced through them for the nth time. And because you always have to route through Mean Street to get to the other hubs, as there is no fast travel or way to jump directly between them, you'll get to that point past patience very quickly, while trying to chew through all of this adventure game nonsense it's set before you in order to add a few extra hours to the runtime. Thankfully though, those gears we need to progress can be found right here on Mean Street, and after helping Pete and Horace, we're all set to head to OsTown so we can continue chasing after that confounding Cottontail and see what Mickey's neighborhood looks like in this twisted mirror of the happiest place on Earth. Entering OsTown, we find a rundown simulacrum of Mickey's familiar cul-de-sac, featuring a street lined with half-painted houses, Donald's tugboat sunk in a river of thinner, and ominous inky peaks hiding behind the facade of green hills. And one of those peaks is our ultimate destination, as Clarabelle Cow lets us know that Oswald has already left OsTown and is headed for his base of operations at the top of MickeyJunk Mountain. Like Horace, Clarabelle is another former regular of Mickey's retinue, one who has long since been put out to pasture and sent to this land of misfit tunes, though she has made a nice life for herself here in OsTown and chats regularly with her equine counterpart back on Mean Street. Putting her to the side, though, the question remains as to how we're going to get up to MickeyJunk, as unsurprisingly the way forward is blocked off. Further shocking no one, we'll need the help of a local gremlin to progress, and thankfully there's one trapped in a nearby safe that's precariously dangling from the roof of the local abandoned gag factory, though there's a hapless reformed pirate loitering underneath. And so, once again, Mickey's morals come into play, as you can then either drop the safe and squash the pirate, hardly a friendly thing to do, or chat with the pirate, who will give you the safe's combination in exchange for painting his house, so you can clamber up there and free the gremlin safely. It's not exactly the subtlest of dilemmas, and most of the choices you'll face are like this, letting you either play Mickey as the friendly, helpful mouse we've all come to know and love, or as kind of a dick. And frankly, there is potential in the idea of being able to let Mickey act a bit meaner, but it's not really put to proper use here at all. Sure, you can choose all the negative options you like and go full thinner, but at the end of the day, the only major changes are the ending slides and how much busy work you're going to have to suffer through. That's because whether you play it nice or nasty, the tunes of the Wasteland will largely treat Mickey like he's the same happy-go-lucky leader of the club that he's always been. All you'll really get from being an asshole is the odd bit of worry from Gus as you take these out-of-character actions, and people looking a bit glum if you return to Mean Street with more green than blue on your bar. And Mickey doesn't reflect his apparent change in attitude either, with his demeanor and dialogue staying the same no matter what, so making those nastier choices just ends up feeling incongruous, and runs against his otherwise sunny disposition and established character. Now, to be fair, and to pull back the curtain slightly, I do suspect that this messy bit of tonal disparity is thanks to some changes in design happening a bit too late in development. That's because, in some of the original concepts, if Mickey leaned a little too hard on the thinner and made foul choices, he would start to have the color drain out of him, and take on a feral, bestial form. Hardcore as that was, it was eventually toned down to him becoming Scrapper Mickey instead, muting his colors and giving him American box art eyebrows if he took an evil turn. But then even this was removed in favor of just giving him the guardian spirits. Reading articles about it from back in the day, Scrapper Mickey's removal was pretty controversial, as Mickey changing form to reflect his choices was one of the big features touted during that Game Informer reveal in October of 2009. Reading the comments and forums, people assumed it was cut due to focus testing and Disney's meddling, the company labeling it too off-brand for the character. But apparently the feature was actually removed at Warren Spector's behest, as he thought the Guardian Spirit system made more sense for representing Mickey's current moral alignment. Speaking of things seen during that initial reveal, ruined animatronic versions of Mickey's pals featured heavily, and you can find one here in OsTown as well, or part of one at least. At the center of the plaza, you'll find Goofy's head on a plinth like he's some sort of slack-jawed sacrifice, having since been torn apart by the Mad Doctor's mechanical monstrosities. Despite this, he's in surprisingly good spirits, and asks that you go fetch his bits from Tomorrow City, which we'll do later on. And in order to get the good ending, you'll need to fix him up alongside robotic versions of Donald and Daisy. For all three, their bits are hidden among the actual proper platforming levels in the game, meaning every now and again, you get to open a chest and pull out a ragged torso. Which is pretty metal, I'll give it that. But why are there mechanical versions of Mickey's crew in the first place, you might be asking? Well, that's because Oswald, ever jealous of Mickey, wanted to have a set of friends as nice as his, so he cooked up his own troop of doppelgangers with the help of the Mad Doctor before the Doctor ended up betraying him. Speaking of which, we still need to get some answers from that fuzzy little fink. So after freeing the gremlin from the safe and retrieving his wrench from Mickey's phone, who apparently locked the gremlin in there in the first place out of the fear of being dismantled, it's cartoon logic, don't question it, we're able to proceed forward to the base of MickeyJunk Mountain. And despite MickeyJunk being a bit tortured as a name, the place certainly lives up to it, being a massive towering peak constructed entirely from old, thrown-away Disney merch. Steps are cut from yellowed comics and picture books. Cracked game cartridges with torn labels float as platforms in the thinner, and worn Mickey dolls, frayed and stitched and then frayed some more, hide behind every corner, looming over the player with vacant grins. It's quite a sight, and about as close as this game ever really gets to some of those darker bits of initial concept art, and it's easily one of my favorite locations in this game. Not to get all sniffy art critic for a moment, but I just love how the design of this area works on both a surface, but also subtextual level. On its face, this area feels like it has something to say about the overt commercialization of Mickey and Disney over the decades. It's a monument to their legacy that's been reduced to a gaudy pile of worthless plastic tat, a kingdom turned to trash as it sold its soul piece by piece. But there's a key element here that implies something deeper, and that's just how worn out all of these items are, because it shows that they were well used and loved. I look at this level, and I see cartridges for games I played back in the day. I see books I borrowed from the library as a child and that I still see in thrift stores today and have bought for my son. I see toys that even if I personally never had them growing up, the evidence that they were some tot's treasure is clear. And what this level represents is all of those good memories we had with this stuff when we were kids. Even if as adults, our relationship with that brand has changed and potentially soured. That specific feeling of conflicted nostalgia is what I think Epic Mickey is trying to represent as a whole. And while it doesn't always hit that mark, MickeyJunk Mountain feels like the game putting that idea forward as its thesis statement. And it's an effective one at that. I guess while I'm mooning over the art design in this level, I might as well talk about the visuals overall, which are quite good. As far as the sheer art design is concerned, I think it manages to strike a nice balance. It's moody and atmospheric while not being overbearing or betraying the spirit of the source material, managing to keep an appropriate amount of Disney whimsy. I will say that the color palette is a bit more muted than I'd like overall, with even the stuff that's shellacked with paint feeling a bit dull where mechanically it should now really pop, but I think to some degree that's just a consequence of the era and the hardware. The Wii is basically just a gussied up GameCube after all, and it does feel like that ended up being a limiting factor. That's likely why some areas are a little sparser of props, and it feels like they were intended to be looking at some of the concept art. And you can definitely see where they were cutting whatever polygons they could, hence most of the interiors being just 2D boxes rather than actual rendered geometry. Not that the game looks bad by any means, that quality art design absolutely shines through, regardless of the technical shortcomings. But it is clear they were cutting corners to make it fit on the platform, and getting back to the color palette, I suspect it's ever so slightly on the darker side to help hide some of those rough edges. That being said, something I do really want to applaud is how consistent the game looks overall. With there being this mix of painted and thinned assets, things could have gotten out of hand really quickly and become a dissonant hodgepodge, but they managed to find a way to keep it all distinct and readable while also looking like it all belongs. Putting the environments aside, though, and focusing on Mickey himself, they also put some really solid work bringing the apple of Walt's eye to life and giving him back some of his old charm. You might have noticed already, but Mickey here is sporting his current design seen in the more recent run of shorts, which is informed by his old 1920s design, with the white face and a thinner, more mouse-like profile. This is as opposed to his more typical mid-century appearance with the flesh-toned face and slightly chubbier, more cherubic proportions. This ends up giving him back some of his original mischievous energy, and I feel like it really works well for the material, given how much of this game leans on his history and that opening era of Disney's filmography. On that same note, it's interesting to see that this virtual version of Mickey follows most of the basic principles of animation set forth in The Illusion of Life, a style guide that gave Disney cartoons their signature look. This can best be seen in his jump, which if you look at it frame by frame, perfectly emulates the classic squash and stretch. Mickey elongates as he takes off, and then flattens down as he lands, just as he would do if he were drawn, and it definitely helps give the action some weight and emphasis it wouldn't otherwise have. Something else notable is that no matter how Mickey is facing, his ears are always visible, and either on top or on the side of his head. This is another classic design standard, but specific for the character, and was apparently mandated by Disney. And while it can look a bit weird in practice as his ears slide around his skull, it does ensure he always has a very readable silhouette. Speaking of seeing those unmistakable ears everywhere, let's get back to our climb up MickeyJunk, shall we? We started off at the bottom of the mountain, sprightly jumping around an ocean of thinner, worked our way through the core of the peak, which has been repurposed by the Mad Doctor as a factory to churn out his mechanical menaces, and finally, arriving at the top, we find Oswald's fortress. The way in, however, is blocked off by a giant gate, only opened after you slay a slew of blotlings or do some tricky platforming to power up some generators. Entering Oswald's castle, we get a better sense of who and what Oswald is, with Gus explaining his history for Mickey and for those who aren't up on their Disney lore. Brushing over the legal troubles we covered earlier of why he was left out of Walt's pantheon, it's explained that Oswald was a former star who was then forgotten when Mickey came onto the scene, and has now been left to languish as the king of the cast-offs, building the Wasteland to help house all of those bygone toons like himself. And after running through a few pieces of his salad days to help impress the guards and gain an audience, we discover that Oswald unsurprisingly holds quite the grudge against Mickey for stealing his limelight. Not that his post-fame life has been all bitterness, though. He was happy here with his robot friends, his mini-equivalent Hortensia, and their 420 children. That is until the Thinner disaster ruined everything. On that fateful day, a hole opened up in the sky, and not only was the world drowned in Thinner, but the Shadow Blot was released as well. And as Oswald tells Mickey all of this, Mickey realizes that he's the one who caused it. Despite the pangs of guilt, though, it's clear that Oswald despises him enough as is, so Mickey decides to keep it under his hat for the time being. Even without knowing Mickey was the unwitting architect of his misfortune, though, Oswald still wants his rival out of the Wasteland so he can go back to sulking in peace. And realizing Mickey still has his heart, he has a plan to make that happen. You see, when cartoon characters are forgotten and are sent to the Wasteland, the first thing they lose is their heart, and without a heart, they can't leave. As Mickey managed to fend off the doctor's impromptu surgery earlier, this restriction does not apply to him. With that in mind, and remembering that there's a rocket sitting in Tomorrow City, Oswald lays out a plan to ship the mouse back home, after which the group heads back to Mean Street so they can scoot over to the land of tomorrow. Each of the projectors leading to the other parts of the park will require an increasing number of power sparks to open up. So the first order of business once we return to Mean Street will be some more busy work to obtain those. And this will be the regular flow going forward, taking an intermission between the major sections of the plot so we can piddle about doing detective work for Horace, rounding up Oswald's rambunctious children for Pete, and taking care of as many other minor chores as our patience will allow. After exhausting our appetite for filler and obtaining the needed power sparks, though, it's off to Tomorrow City, and this is perhaps the most cut and dry section of the game. There's no hub area to explore first, no wider mystery to solve, we just need to progress through each area to reach the rocket. Not that it's a simple task. To start off with, we'll need to get to the city proper by raising up a familiar-looking submarine, the Nautilus, and then dam up a deluge of thinner to actually open the way inside, all while battling against the Mad Doctor's animatronics, which are known as Beetleworks. They are the other side of this game's enemy roster, providing some variants from all the goo monsters, and annoyingly make up the majority of the foes we'll face in this level. I say annoying because the Beetleworks don't function in quite the same way as the Blotlings do. Rather than just dousing them in paint or thinner, you need to thin off their facade first and then give them a whack when they open up for it, forecasted by a green light flashing on their frame. And for most of them, you'll need to do this multiple times to take them down. It's a drawn-out, but not altogether difficult process, and easy enough to handle individually, but the issue is they rarely send them at you solo. More often than not, you'll have to deal with multiple Beetleworks at a time, sometimes spawning indefinitely, all trying to keep track of where you're at with each one, and then things are made even worse when Blotlings get added to the mix, especially if you're doing a paint run. Trying to carefully strip the armor off the Beetleworks while avoiding thinning your converted Blotlings and washing your paint off of them, all while they're all diving into the fracas to fight each other, is incredibly frustrating to say the least. Especially when the controls you have at hand are less than elegant, though I'm gonna get into that in a bit. Thankfully, it's not all Beetleworks to fight in this section of the park though, and in fact, once we get past the thinner waterfall and make our way inside, we'll be set upon by our first Slobber, a Blotling bruiser that can ravage Mickey with both its claws and a belch of acid, and takes 3 full applications of paint or thinner to bring down. Once it's defeated, you'll hear a voice boom out over the PA, praising or admonishing you depending on how you handled it. This is the mighty guardian of Tomorrow City, its lone protector, the voice of the future, and it's some random fucking sepia-toned dog NPC. For as much as I praise this game's use of nostalgia in the last level, and for as much as this game generally does do a decent job of cutting deep with its references, such as the submersible we rode in on, it sure does also contain a lot of missed opportunities in that regard, especially when it comes to the NPCs. All in all, they're broken down to a few very limited archetypes, with most roles being filled by the sepia sackcloth-wearing barnyard folk, and it quickly starts to feel very limiting. This is especially the case when those same generic characters are used in spots that really could have benefited from a unique face to help them stand out from the crowd, as they often have side quests or key information to give you. And it's not like there isn't a wide well of characters to use here. The Disney Vault is chock full of forgotten second stringers who would perfectly fit some of these roles. Glinda, the NPC who challenges you to foot races, for example, well, that very well could have been the rabbit from the Tortoise and the Hare shorts. In Bog Easy, once we get there, there's an NPC who advises Mickey on mystical matters. Why isn't that perhaps Witch Hazel from Trick or Treat? And as for this caretaker of Tomorrow City, well, pulling from the same theme park history as the Nautilus from earlier, while also fitting that idea of your action shaping the future, well, that could have been Dreamfinder and Figment from the never-realized Discovery Bay concepts and then later Epcot. Sure, that's an extremely obscure pull, and most players would have no idea who in God's name those two are, but if there was ever a game where it made sense to make that kind of reference, it's the one where the whole damn point is throwing back to the niche forgotten corners of Disney's history. It just feels like such a slapdash waste in a game that otherwise clearly comes from a place of true passion for the source material and does a fantastic job of putting in as many little touches as they could. You can see that right back on Mean Street whenever you visit Oswald, as they ensured that whenever Mickey has his back turned to him, Oswald will childishly wag his tongue at Mickey, before quickly snapping back to an innocent whistle whenever you turn to look at him. It's a wonderful little bit of extra character added through animation. It's playful and perfectly cartoony, and it shows how much care went into this game. And that impression is soured when you walk a block down and see the same damn black and white anthropomorphic goat 3 times in a row. Oh well. While the caretaker of Tomorrow City, being a generic NPC, does deflate the moment of entering this section of the park, he does at least reward us for defeating the slobber by giving us our first sketch. Sketches are a consumable resource that we can use to summon up different things into the world for momentary benefits, with this first one being a TV that can distract enemies with a little snippet of Steamboat Willie, while also powering up certain switches. We'll get a couple more of these as time goes on, but to be honest, I never really found them all that useful, as they don't last for too long, and the base combat is rarely so harrowing that the edge they provide feels all that necessary. As such, their primary use is going to be for solving puzzles, such as helping to get the people mover going in the next area so we can proceed to the rocket pad. Once there, after battling some more beetleworks and getting the elevator powered up, we meet up with Oswald, who's been checking over the rocket, which is unfortunately out of order. It seems that the Mad Doctor was here earlier and ripped a bunch of parts out of it, all while doing a trademark villainous cackle. Those bits have since been spread across the park, and we'll need to track them down. One has been lost at sea in VentureLand's Tortuga, another has been stashed in the Lonesome Manor in Bog-Easy, and the last is thankfully here in Tomorrow City, though it's in the hands of the corrupted Pete-tronic. Grabbing that bit first, the fight against Pete-tronic is another fun bit of nostalgia, duking it out with a troned up version of Pete on top of Space Mountain. And on paper, it's a simple enough affair. He throws out thinner to dissolve the platforms, you dodge until he gets fed up, and then you do a quick rally with him to break his shield before filling his tank up with either paint or thinner. Do that 3 times and you've got your part, which is a Tron disc of course, and you're back to Mean Street. In practice though, it's not quite that easy, because that rally I mentioned requires you to use your spin move with pretty precise timing, and if there was ever an input that lacked precision, it's waggling. And thus is the angular white elephant in the room revealed, which is the fact that one of Epic Mickey's greatest flaws is that it is on the Wii. Now, to be completely upfront and fair, we are well over a decade past the Wii's heyday, and as such all the hardware I'm using is second-hand, and my setup is slightly non-standard for the sake of capture, potentially introducing some delay. But that said, I did test the game wired right to my TV as well, and even then the controls feel quite sluggish. And when it comes to the cursor and motion controls, inconsistent. How much movement is required to trigger a spin when you waggle is determined by the twist of your wrist, which isn't nearly as clean as a button press. And maybe it's my third-party Wii sensor, but the pointer felt as though it had a very low polling rate, for lack of a better term, giving it an uncanny sense of acceleration. That strange sense of motion takes some time to get used to, and when you're trying to paint precisely in the heat of battle, that slipperiness is less than ideal. As for the waggling, thankfully it's rarely something you need to do with any real care, as it's mostly just used to whack destructibles for goodies, with the exception of this fight against Pete-tronic. That rally section where you're knocking his disc back and forth asks for tight and exact timing and at an ever-increasing pace, with failure meaning you have to do the first part again where you avoid his thinner shots, but now with less platforms to work with. It's infuriating, to put it lightly, and it was easily the boss fight in this game I spent the most time on, failing repeatedly as I tried to wrangle my Wiimote into reading those waggles consistently and with the correct timing. But like I said, my equipment here is old, some of it is third party, and capture is a factor as well. However, the issues with Epic Mickey and it being stuck on the Wii extend beyond those that could be caused by a little wear and tear on the hardware. Chief among them is the camera, which is absolutely atrocious in this game by default, with the controls not helping in the slightest. As your pointer is preoccupied with, well, pointing, and the stick on the nunchuck is needed for movement, the camera is stuck being shackled to the world's most awkwardly placed D-pad and the C button. Hitting the D-pad will cause the camera to slowly lilt in your chosen direction, barely fast enough to comfortably orient yourself and completely impractical to use during combat or platforming. Hitting the C button, on the other hand, will shunt it back to the center, which works far better, but is anything but smooth, and harkens back to the kind of rough camera controls we got back in the early PS2 days. There is one other view option you have as well, in the form of a first-person mode, which you can activate with the 1 button, but with that you're locked in place, and it's mostly for distance precision painting. And all of this is just so that you can fight with the automatic camera, which will try to follow Mickey, centering him and turning accordingly, but is slow to catch up when things get hectic and can easily get caught on geometry. Meaning realistically, you'll spend most of the game hammering the C button every couple of minutes. None of this makes the game unplayable, mind you, and after some time you do eventually get into a groove where you adapt to all the jank and clutch. But the game never ends up feeling actually good to play as a result. It feels like driving an old jalopy where you're constantly having to babysit the choke and pray the engine doesn't explode. And that is entirely down to the controls, the camera, and how they interact. And I can say for a fact that I know this game would play far better with a regular controller and traditional control scheme. But we'll get to that much later. For now, though, what matters is that Pete-Tronic has been successfully painted into friendly submission, albeit with no small amount of struggle, and we can return to Mean Street with our prize in tow. Back on Mean Street, the story is the same as ever, and we go futz around and do some chores to get the requisite number of power sparks needed to open the way to our next destination, VentureLand. And that brief pause in the action makes this the perfect opportunity to slip back to OsTown and go and give Goofy back his bits, as we grab those while we were traipsing through Tomorrow City. While the reunion does come with a bit of pomp and circumstance, like most other things in this game, it doesn't really lead to much. Reassembling these animatronic copies of your pals only serves to unlock a few extra side quests, and as I mentioned earlier, it ensures some nicer ending slides, so don't fret too much if you don't find all their pieces, especially if you're going for a thinner run. That said, if you do miss a limb somewhere, thankfully you're able to buy them after the fact from the local shops. They're pricey for sure, but at least it's something to spend all those e-tickets on. Anyways, with that and a number of other ancillary tasks sorted, we've got the sparks we need, and we're off to the game's Adventureland analog, which is mostly about pirates, despite the Pirates of the Caribbean ride being in New Orleans Square, which we'll be going to after this. Messy theming aside, our time here starts off in the Tiki Village, which has been overrun by some cowardly corsairs, specifically Captain Hook's crew, as we learn from a sobbing Smee. They're here because a mysterious device has appeared on Skull Island that's been turning the pirates there into rampaging cyborgs, Captain Hook first among them. Hook and his new crew of metal marauders have since been hunting down all those who won't join the Buccaneer Board Collective willingly, chasing them out of their home port of Tortuga and stranding them here in Tiki Town. Thankfully, Smee is willing to help us get to Tortuga so we can face off against Hook, but he needs us to fetch some things first to repair a convoluted door opening mechanism, which of course means more busy work. That's most of this chapter actually, with VentureLand being focused on exploration, where Tomorrow City was more about combat, and where the next chapter, Bog Easy, is centered around puzzles. Thankfully, the faffing about is largely self-contained here, with most of the tasks set forth being completable without having to go through one of those 2D level transitions. That said, there is one nasty bit here in Tiki Village that if you're doing it right, We'll send you all the way back to OsTown, so that you can then be told to scour both OsTown and Main Street for flowers, so you can go back to OsTown to get them made into a bouquet. Also, you can head back to VentureLand to help this blushing buccaneer romance a cow. Which opens up questions all of its own. Questionable interspecies cartoon courtship aside, though, and some other stuff sorted, Smee lets us through to a very quiet Tortuga, where we catch some of the last remaining pirates there on the way out. Managing to catch one before he leaves, he lets us know that a gentleman Starkey, who's hiding out in the jungle, will help us make our way to Skull Island and to Hook, and he's even willing to open the way for us, in exchange for more busy work. At the very least, in the process of that, he's nice enough to give us our next sketch, the stopwatch. As you might expect, this slows down time for a scant few seconds, allowing you to get a free hit or two in during combat and slowing down fast-moving mechanisms during puzzles. That said, there's only a couple of puzzles where that slowdown is genuinely needed, and it doesn't last as long as the TV, which also lets you get some free hits in, and which I already barely used. Regardless, it's helpful enough in our efforts to get the stranded pirate's stuff back and free his buddies from jail, allowing us to access the jungle. As was promised, here we meet Starkey, who makes it clear he's no friend of Hook, and while he's willing to help us get to him, he needs us to go do more busy work, specifically finding 3 hidden pirate symbols, along with clearing out the jungle of the lingering threats hanging about. Starkey also lets us know that a certain hero in green tights is flitting about Skull Island. I'm sure you can guess who, and he's the key to getting the good ending in this level. But first things first, we can take a nice hike through the jungle, find those symbols, and enjoy the sounds of nature, which makes this a good time to talk about the sound design in this game. Much like the visual presentation, the soundscape in Epic Mickey is another highlight of the experience, though with some notable drawbacks, chiefly the lack of voice acting. Now, that's not to say they didn't get the correct actors in for the game. Characters with an established voice like Mickey and Pete sound correct, and you'll hear them plenty. They just don't talk. They mumble. For whatever reason, I'm gonna guess a combination of disk space and production cost, they chose to do the entire game Banjo-Kazooie style, and voiced every line with a series of repeated grumbles, grunts, and haws. In a vacuum, that would be fine. It's a serviceable enough solution that has worked for plenty of other games. But here, it just feels like wasted potential, and frankly a bit lazy given the brand involved. Even worse, it does absolutely put a damper on some of the more emotional story moments, with the mumbles making many of the cutscenes, which are often used for a lot of the more pivotal plot conversations, fall flat. Speaking of the cutscenes, let's put the audio aside and talk about those for a second, because I realized I didn't talk about them when we did visuals. Outside of the opening and closing cutscenes and boss fights, cutaways here are all done in an animated 2D style, and by and large I think they look pretty good. Stylistically, they don't really have an analog within the rest of Mickey's historical milieu, instead having their own slightly washed out and abstract storybook look to them, which works given the subject matter and the Alice in Wonderland parallels going on. The only issue with them is that they're used kind of inconsistently, with most big story moments having them, but then some not, and then a bunch of side quests getting them, but not all of them. It's all over the place. They also tend towards being used for conversational moments rather than showcasing action, those scenes happening more in-engine, which, like the voice acting, feels like a bit of a missed opportunity. Regardless though, they do the job just fine, and they're helped along by the fantastic soundtrack, which goes a long way to selling the vibe of this game. It's an OST with a very wistful fairy tale quality to it, that then weaves in and out against these big strains of menacing bombast, all with a subtle and spooky strand of tension tying it all together. Each area has its own character too, the instrumentation changing to fit, and in the right moments, the appropriate leitmotif slipping in. The obvious example to cite there is the oppressively off-kilter snippets of It's a Small World that play during the clock tower fight, which really does add to that moment. But another example of this that I really enjoyed is how when you're climbing MickeyJunk Mountain, the Mouse Club March floats into the melody. You don't even notice it at first unless you're listening for it, but once you hear it, it really adds to the character of that level. It's also worth noting that the soundtrack does change based on your moral standing. Not dramatically so, it's still the same themes, but the underlying supporting instruments and tenor change. With a paint run, you'll get a lighter, more hopeful backing layer of things like flutes and timpani, whereas a thinner run gives you a more dour and grim undercurrent of deeper instruments like tuba and bass drums. That shift between extremes is very distinct, but also generally pretty subtle, and much like the visual side of that moral split, those layers shift back and forth in a way that feels pleasant and consistent, adding nuance to the experience without muddying the through line of the score. That strong soundtrack is something that's on full display here in VentureLand as well, especially after we find those symbols for Starkey and then route back through Tortuga to make our way to Hook. This takes us on a quick boat ride through a burning colonial Caribbean town and set of jail cells that will look familiar to any animatronic aficionados out there, before dropping us onto the beachhead of Skull Island. From here, we can stop the machine that's been turning all the pirates into beetleworks, as well as raise Smee's ship from the drink so that we can take it out to sea and face the Jolly Roger. But before we do, if we sneak around back and scale the cranial summit, we can find that beloved hero of impish glee, the emblem of childhood rebellion, that agile flying fencer of storybook lore, Pete. It's goddamn Pete again. He's also not quite feeling himself, something Big Bad Pete will actually let you in on before you leave Mean Street if you ask. And Pete Pan here says it's because Hook has captured his legally distinct sprite friend. It's not Tinkerbell, she's too much of an actual Disney mascot to be here in the Wasteland with the benchwarmers, but regardless, he's despondent and not up to fighting the robotic old salt without his copyright-friendly Fae. That leaves us two options when we get to the Jolly Roger and face off against a mechanized Hook. We can either play his game on the deck, mucking about with gears to eventually send him spiraling off the plank and into the waiting jaws of a skinned skeletal TikTok the crocodile, or we can take to the rigging and platform along the mast, avoiding the captain as we make our way to Pan's sprite, giving him the kick and the tights needed to duel his robotic rival. Either way, our reward is the missing gear stick for the rocket, and now we can head back to Mean Street so we can open the way to Bog Easy and find the remaining piece for the rocket there that we need to get the hell out of here. Back through Mean Street with a bit more busy work sorted for Power Sparks, and we're off to Bog Easy, a painfully punny take on The Big Easy, and the game's version of New Orleans Square. Once we arrive in the swampy outskirts, though, Mickey is approached by a group of ghosts lurking around the abandoned riverboat. It seems they've been driven out of the nearby Lonesome Manor, which is conveniently exactly where we're heading. They offer to open up the way for us, but only if we help them scare the local citizenry. Thankfully though, in following this game's light ImSim design, we can alternatively help bolster the residents' courage instead, and then a random sepia-toned goat lady will let us in. That said, even if we don't help the ghosts with their haunting, they would still like Mickey to settle things inside the mansion so that they can return, which is in everyone's best interests. Either way, after either scaring or saving the kind folk of Bog Easy, we then weave through the headstones to reach the palatial entrance of the antebellum estate and find the Mad Doctor just loitering around out front. He tauntingly rambles at us for a bit before effing off back to the attic so we can wait for us there to do a boss fight, but he does leave a treasure chest behind up on the balcony containing the last variety of sketch, the anvil. And the anvil does exactly what you'd expect. You can drop it in combat to squish foes, you can use it to activate pressure pads, you can even use it to get a little leg up with platforming. And like with all the other sketches, it's largely unnecessary most of the time outside of very specific scripted moments. Still though, we're going to need it going forward as the Lonesome Manor is a room-to-room gauntlet of light puzzle solving, asking you to hunt around and set things right to help settle the restless spirits causing chaos in the place before you can proceed. And like the ride it's based on, there are definitely some major highlights. The famous stretching room is one, though not in a good way. While the solution to this puzzle is obvious, just line up the pictures properly, how the room actually works is not clear in the slightest, and the whole thing feels somewhat ill-designed as you muck around behind the paintings trying to sort it out. Another standout area is the library, which is staffed by Madame Leona, the spectral mascot for the ride, with her doling out tasks that you can complete to gain a few pins and help tame the house. And while we're in this layer of letters, I think that's as good a spot as any to take an aside and discuss the writing in this game. Now, given that Epic Mickey is essentially a kid's game, and one based on characters made famous in 5-minute shorts at that, it does make sense that the story here is smaller and simpler in scope. After all, it's basically just a rough, Cliff Notes retelling of Alice in Wonderland, with some intentional slight edge to it. A quick riff in the key of American McGee, if you will. And while telling that general story in a slimmed-down format does add to the dreamlike quality of the proceedings, it does also lead to the overall plot feeling loose and patchy, without enough intermediate material to hold it together. Now, that's not to say they didn't have grander ideas for the narrative here, and didn't have further characters and themes in mind to explore, as the marketing, concept art, and even the opening cinematic all hint at something larger. Not that I would call any of that stuff misleading either, though, because frankly, this is a game where I suspect there were tons of ideas in motion throughout all stages of development that were heavily trimmed back over time. So what was on the table one day could very well be on the cutting room floor the next. But what bits and pieces did manage to stick around from conception to release are all really interesting. Things like Oswald's resentment and rivalry for Mickey, the idea of a purgatory for forgotten fictional characters, and making the whole thing a reflection on Disney as a larger presence, viewed through the lens of both their real world and cartoon creations, are all really neat ideas on a fundamental level. Sadly though, thanks to how slapdash the plot feels, the game doesn't really do as much with those concepts as I'd like, with too much time spent figuring out how to get Mickey from A to B. But even so, those ideas still aren't just window dressing either, and you do get some solid instances where that core shines through. Moments like Mickey not recognizing Horace or Clarabelle and clearly feeling guilty about it, or Oswald referencing Walt Disney in a slightly bitter, fatherly context. And in that same vein, Oswald then enviously building the friends he felt he was denied in the form of the animatronics, mirroring Walt jealously drawing up Mickey when he was denied Oswald. All of these provide some really nuanced and emotive expressions of those main concepts. But those are just moments, glimmers of potential where all the gears are moving in sync, and the rest of the time, those teeth don't quite meet, making for a clunky sense of motivation and plot progression. At best, those planes in between provide a narrative experience on par with any other rote platformer where the goal is simply to move you from level to level, but in that quiet comes introspection, and that's when you start to see the holes in the world are far from just the literal ones caused by thinner. Now, this is a magic dream world, so I'm not here to chastise it for failing to obey any sort of real-world logic, but it does make the mistake of creating its own rules and order that, when contemplated, create some issues. The biggest of which being, where the hell is everyone? The Wasteland is intended to be a repository for forgotten cartoon characters, a place all of Disney's creations are sent once they fade from the public eye. But the threshold for how forgotten they need to be feels unclear. Oswald, Horace, and Clarabelle, for example, they hadn't shown up in decades, with their cartoons rarely, if ever, and never in the case of Oswald, being rerun. Them being here makes complete sense. But what about Smee and Hook's pirate crew? Peter Pan is hardly a forgotten Disney property. As I alluded to earlier, Tinkerbell was even essentially an alternate company mascot for quite some time. And I know the movie was part of the cavalcade of 90s VHS releases, so it's certainly not gone from the public eye. As such, if Peter Pan, or at least the side characters from it, count as being forgotten by this world's standard, then where is the extended cast of The Jungle Book, The Sword and the Stone, or Robin Hood? And let's actually take that a step further. where's everyone from some of the other more obscure and actually forgotten things like The Black Cauldron, The Adventures of Ichabod and Mr. Toad, or any of the Disney wartime musical anthologies? Instead, we only see a very small handful of semi-recognizable outcasts, a plethora of generic NPCs, and a half dozen Petes. And those Petes lead to another problem. As was explained way back when we first hit Mean Street, there are multiple Petes here because it's not just the core, central version of a character that can be sent to the Wasteland when left to rot, but also every individual variant of that character. Which leads to the larger question of why this place isn't drowning in copies of all the more known characters. Where is George Geef, Goofy's non-hick alter ego from the How To series, or all the goof people we see in those shorts? Where is the early long-necked version of Donald from The Wise Little Hen before he became part of Mickey's entourage? And speaking of the main mouse himself, where are all the Mickeys? The brave little tailor Mickey? That's not core Mickey, he should be here. Bard Mickey from the olden days? That's not core Mickey, he should be here. Hell, depending on how loose you want to go with it, Mickey's held more jobs over the years than Mario. And each of those could conceivably be considered a variant that could and perhaps should be here in the Wasteland. So I ask again, where is everyone? Why is it only Pete that gets to exist here in multiple states? And the answer to that, aside from the reality that many characters being packed on screen at once would cause the Wii to explode, is that having them here would ruin the story. If there are countless Goofies, Donalds, and Daisies to choose from, then Oswald doesn't have to make animatronic versions of them, meaning he never gets involved with the Mad Doctor. And if there are Mickeys aplenty, then Oswald can see that Mickey is just like him, and he can work through his envy, realizing that everyone gets forgotten over time. So much of the motivation and theming holding this story together is built upon a sense of loneliness and abandonment. But if this place suddenly contains multitudes more than exist outside the Wasteland, that all falls apart. But even if ignoring those oversights makes for a better story, that doesn't mean it's not a massive, gaping plot hole that absolutely dampens the experience if you're the kind of person who can't help but think about those sorts of things. And while I'm complaining about missing characters and pointing out plot holes, there is someone else who, even taking this game's reasoning completely at face value, is noticeably absent. And that's Pluto the dog, or rather an animatronic version of him. It just strikes me as odd that Oswald go to the lengths of building his own version of Mickey's friends, but then not make a copy of his faithful hound. I get him not making a Minnie. He has his wife Hortensia who fills that niche quite cleanly after all, to the point of her living in Minnie's house. But why would he not make himself a copy of Mickey's canine companion? It just feels like a very strange omission, and one that does slightly undermine the fundamentally well-developed character they put together in Oswald, as it casts doubts on how jealous he really is. If you're the sort to overanalyze, which is kind of my job here, these sorts of things are absolutely maddening, and as such, that's probably a good place to stop picking at these narrative scabs and return to the Lonesome Manor. After resolving things in the library and then helping to fix the organ in the main ballroom by flailing through one of the more annoying platforming challenges in this game, we finally reach the attic and the Mad Doctor. This place acts as his base of operations, and it's been wired up with a series of generators that are constantly pumping out more and more beetleworks. We need to shut down all of these machines in order to end the Doctor's reign of terror, and if you've been dutifully saving trapped gremlins throughout the level, they'll deal with most of them for you. No matter what though, you're going to have to handle the main generator at the back of the attic yourself, and as with all the other bosses, you've got two ways of going about it. You can manually destroy it by taking out the beetleworks in front before thinning a key part on the inside as it tries to generate fresh ones, and this is considered the evil thinner way of doing things, for some reason. And I say for some reason because the painterly path here is far more destructive. That involves you using each of your sketches in concert to enact a painstakingly exact sequence of events that sends one of the ride cars hurtling across the room and crashing into the machine. Either way, your rampant destruction reveals the reason for all of the Mad Doctor's foul deeds, and that's the fact that he himself is an animatronic. That's why he's allied himself with the Shadow Blot, because if he can help it take over the Wasteland and further flood it with thinner, then, being metal, only the animatronics will remain, and he will reign as their king. This is another potentially really cool idea, with a theoretical civil war between toons and animatronics being a fantastic concept for the setting. But that's quickly swept under the rug as Gus retrieves the last component we need for the rocket from the Doctor's floating Eggman pod, causing it to malfunction and sending him sailing off into the stratosphere. And with the villain safely out of mind and out of the story, we head back to Mean Street to report to Oswald so he can repair the rocket and we can head home. But of course, the tale doesn't end there. Once we arrive back on Mean Street, Oswald tells us that fixing up the rocket will need to be put on hold, as the Shadow Blot is besieging MickeyJunk Mountain and trying to reach the massive sealed jug that sits at its summit. As such, we head up there with Oswald, and while he defends the jug from a wave of blotlings, we take on the Shadow Blot itself in single combat. Ultimately, it's not really that much of a fight, working similarly to all of the slobbers we've fought previously. He zips around clawing at you and shooting out thinner, before eventually flying up into the sky and raining down attacks, before then slamming down and trying to suck you in, just like the slobbers do. And just as you do with them, you then fill his gullet with either paint or thinner. Do that 3 times, and the fight will then end with an appropriately friendly or grisly animation, and Mickey will rush over to the jug, helping Oswald slide the massive cork back into place. With a moment to breathe, Oswald lets us know that the entity we just fought was not actually the Shadow Blot. The real Shadow Blot is far larger and more powerful, but was thankfully sealed in the jug years ago by Oswald and his lady friend Hortensia, though she sadly fell in the battle. The shadowy creature that dragged us into the Wasteland and that we just fended off was simply a congealed mass of the dregs that have seeped out over the years, a mere fraction of the Blot's true essence. Regardless of the foe, though, Mickey has still helped save the day, and in doing so he's impressed Oswald enough for him to finally let go of his resentment and reach out to Mickey as a friend. But, being the conscientious mouse that he is, the guilt finally gets the better of him, and it's now that Mickey finally tells Oswald that he was the one to cause the thinner disaster all those years ago, and that the Blot and the state of the Wasteland are all his fault. Understandably, Oswald is quite pissed to hear this, and clambers up on top of the jug, calling Mickey out and demanding a duel, not realizing that his scampering is cracking the cork and breaking the seal. Eventually, it's all too much, and the bottle blows open, with the massive, malefic, true form of the Blot pouring out. The horrible entity quickly scoops up both Gus and Oswald, pulling them into its inky mass, and then it offers Mickey a deal. In exchange for his friend's freedom, the Blot wants his heart, and ever the martyr, Mickey accepts. With this newfound power at its disposal, the Blot spits out Gus and Oswald and flies up into the sky, exuding an all-encompassing storm of ink. It then sends tentacles down into the Wasteland to drain it of all of its remaining paint, fueling itself to break free of this realm and go wreak havoc in Mickey's world now that it has a heart that will allow it to leave. While things are looking bleak, Mickey naturally refuses to give up, and convinces Oswald to help him save the Wasteland, with the two coming up with a plan to stop Mickey's awful creation, deciding to aim the rocket right at its new heart to try and take it down. But while it's a solid plan, the Fiend is currently too strong for it to work, thanks to it feeding off the essence of Oswald's world. So while Oswald goes to prep the rocket, Mickey heads off to stop the tentacles. This sees Mickey heading back to all of the main hubs to fight off the tentacles, Bloticles as the game calls them, that have taken root, starting in OsTown, then saving Mean Street, VentureLand, and Bog Easy. There are more in Tomorrow City as well, on the way to meet up with Oswald, but this is also the point of no return in this game. Before you head to Tomorrow City, you should be taking the time to clean up any remaining side quests you want to do, buy any remaining animatronic parts you might have missed so you can restore Goofy, Daisy, and Donald, and scout around for any lingering power sparks. That last thing, in my opinion, is the most interesting, because if you collect a total of 30, the gremlin at the Penny Arcade can unlock a secret area hidden above the Mean Street Fire Station. I'm sure those die-hard Disneyland devotees watching can already guess what's up there, but for those who aren't in the know, that's where Walt Disney's hidden apartment is located in the actual Anaheim location. Once you've snooped in there, though, and handled everything else on your to-do list, you can clear out the remaining blotticles on your way to the rocket and meet up with Oswald. He, Mickey, and Gus then take off, aiming the ship dead at the Blot's new heart, with the goal of self-destructing the rocket once they get close enough. But the beast notices them too soon. It drains the paint out of the machine and sends it spiraling away, the rocket crashing into Dark Beauty Castle, the place where we started this game, and where the final leg of our journey begins. Waking from the crash, Gus lets us know that Oswald has gone on ahead, saying something about fireworks, leaving us to navigate the castle to try and find him. This sees us draining the central chamber we started the game in, which has since been flooded with thinner, as well as exploring the throne room, revealing a bit of Oswald's history here in the Wasteland, before eventually making our way to the fireworks control center. It was from here that Oswald and Hortensia used to put on massive light shows for the residents of the park, but it's seen better days, and all the batteries of fireworks have long since been disabled. That mountain of firepower is just laying dormant though, and Oswald thinks that if it's all set off at once, it should be enough to stop the Blot. As such, he sends Mickey off to climb the castle's 3 spires to light some crystal beacons and reactivate these waiting banks of colorful munitions. This entails us conquering a gauntlet of platforming, as the Blot tears through the towers, splintering load-bearing timbers and littering the place with tentacles. It's an arduous trek up each tower as we dodge the Blot and adapt to the ever-changing scenery. And to be frank, it's one of the worst parts of the game. Not thematically, of course. The tension is high and the theming is good, with the towers being named things like loss and grief, all tying into Oswald's feelings about losing his lady love. But mechanically, this area and most of what's coming are all just the worst. Every little niggle I've had with the nuts and bolts of the gameplay so far comes back here with a vengeance. The camera can barely follow what you're doing, the timing on a lot of the jumps is often tighter than the controls are really built for, and there's a ton of just pure dickishness on display, with platforms that move or fall away in deceiving patterns and checkpoints that are just too spread out. If the platforming overall was less slippery, the controls more fluid, the movement less stodgy and slow, then this section would be a fantastically enjoyable final test of your prowess. But without that, it's just a lot of annoying design decisions all concentrated in one spot. With enough persistence, though, you will eventually get to the top of each tower, where you'll face off against the Blot, spinning some gargoyles around to light those beacons, while it swipes at you and sends in waves of splatters. Do that 3 times, the last time being conspicuously quiet, and you'll have activated all of the banks of fireworks, meaning you're ready to start the show and end this nightmare once and for all. When we return to the control room, though, we're given a moment of pause, as Mickey sees Oswald looking forlornly upon a statue of Hortensia. Oswald then explains that this isn't a statue, but rather all that remains of her after their original fight with the Blot when they sealed it in the jug. Mickey once again apologizes for causing all of this trouble in the first place, and Oswald genuinely accepts it, knowing his hands are no cleaner after having now unleashed the Blot himself. Gus then tries to fix the remote for the big fireworks display, but just as he does, the Blot attacks, once again stealing away both Gus and Oswald. Throwing caution to the wind, Mickey races forward and dives in after them, plunging himself into the inky morass of the shadowy Leviathan before him. Winding through the Blot's slick, thinner-soaked innards sees us quickly reuniting with Gus, before eventually making it to a central chamber of sorts, where we find Oswald glued to the wall, and Mickey's heart in the sickly embrace of a number of blotticles. What follows is another gauntlet of platforming and combat as we move through several different ventricles, popping nodules on the massive tentacles while dodging blotlings of all forms. This section also includes a new and rather unnerving wrinkle in the form of shadow toons, unlucky residents of the Wasteland who have been absorbed by the blot and turned into inky, mindless zombies, which are immune to both paint and thinner and who will rush down Mickey as soon as they see him. Thankfully, they're easy enough to get away from, as they can't jump, so just getting some elevation will give you the needed breathing room to avoid them and plan your next move. Interestingly as well, this is one of the few moments where your morality thus far pays off in a mechanical fashion, with there being more or less zombie toons here to chase you, depending on how much of an ass you've been. Whether you are good or bad, though, you'll eventually manage to cause all 4 of the blotticles to recede, freeing Mickey's heart where it then lands in the hands of Oswald. In this moment, he could take it for himself. After all, it would allow him to escape the Wasteland and return to the limelight, to live the life he so jealously believed Mickey stole from him. But he's grown over the course of this adventure as well, and putting his old envy and hate behind him, he hands the heart to Mickey with a calm smile before hitting the button for the fireworks. With the celebration ignited, the rockets fly forth and destroy the blot in a fabulous display of color and light, sending everyone sailing off in different directions. For his part, Mickey is blasted out of the Wasteland, where Yen Sid immediately catches him and frog marches him back through the mirror before sealing it up for good. But when the wizard goes back to look at his model and survey the damage, he sees that the Wasteland has taken on a magic of its own. Paint rains down across the broken world, mending all the damage done by the blot, both from its recent reign of terror and from the original Thinner disaster. Meanwhile, we see that Oswald has landed back on Main Street, along with the petrified Hortensia, who, in the wash of paint, returns to life and is reunited with her Lapin paramour. We then get a slideshow showing the results of our choices, as was the style at the time, with a little bit of magic allowing Mickey to watch things through the mirror. It all ends with Oswald introducing him to Hortensia, and a path being set forward for them to walk as brothers. The 2 estranged animated sons of Walt, now reunited and finally made family. We then cut to a wonderfully animated ending credit sequence, where we see the splatters capering about before it transitions to a more traditional scrolling format featuring some snippets from the old shorts, before then finally getting to the sequel hook. It seems that despite the path back through the mirror being closed, Mickey still has a little bit of the blot's magic in him, leaving the door open for more adventures in the Wasteland. And that, Mouseketeers, is Epic Mickey. At this point, you can then start up a new game plus and do a run of the opposing art supplies if you so choose, gathering up all the pins you missed. But frankly, I don't know why you'd do that unless you have some sort of brainworm that demands you ceaselessly collect pointless nonsense. Okay, perhaps that's a bit harsh. I certainly didn't hate this game, and there is a lot to like here, but that's mostly in the visuals and the music and the concepts on display, and not in the actual game part of it. To put it bluntly, the moment-to-moment here just isn't very fun, thanks largely to how it feels to play and to some less than well-considered design decisions, all of which we've already covered. It's a lot of little stuff that is just off enough and adds up in such a way that the whole experience is brought down. Frankly, in an age of remasters and remakes and reimaginings, Epic Mickey would be the perfect game to revisit, as it would be so easy to fix and help realize its potential. And thankfully, someone did just that, and mostly succeeded. In February of 2024, it was revealed that THQ Nordic was putting together a remake of Epic Mickey for modern platforms, with the development being done by their Purple Lamp division. Now, say what you want about THQ Nordic, and plenty has been said over the years, especially in regards to their parent company, the Embracer Group, but they have proven time and time again that they do genuinely seem to care about older games and try to do right by gaming history. Not all of their efforts have been perfect, mind, there's plenty of stinkers in their library, but for the most part they've put out a large number of re-releases, remasters, revivals, and remakes that have faithfully done right by their source material. By that same token, their Purple Lamp division has been a big part of that, being responsible for the well-regarded Battle for Bikini Bottom remake, as well as the company's other recent and quite warmly received SpongeBob games. With those mascot platformer bona fides in hand, they were a solid choice to revisit Epic Mickey, and the results of their efforts were Epic Mickey Rebrushed, which released in September of 2024. And having since played through Rebrushed in its entirety, directly after having played through the Wii original, it is genuinely shocking how much of an improvement Rebrushed makes over that base game. Nearly every complaint I had about the 2010 version that could have been addressed without drastically changing the core of what the game is, was fixed up and altered for the better. It's to the point that while I was originally intending to just play Rebrushed for a couple of hours to grab some footage and see what the immediate differences were, I instead played through the entire game again, making that my thinner run because I was just having that much fun with how Rebrushed plays. Unsurprisingly, a lot of that is down to the change in controls, as having an actual camera on the right stick to work with makes a world of difference. Nothing is really lost either by losing the pointer control, as instead paint and thinner is applied as if you were playing a third-person shooter, with a reticle smack dab in the center of the screen, which works just fine and is even more accurate in a lot of scenarios. It does revert to a fixed camera with the stick controlling the pointer in a few select moments, mainly bosses, which can be a bit jarring, but the transition is clean enough, and it's worth it for the rest of the game to play that much smoother with more typical controls. And that smoothness isn't just down to a more traditional button layout, but also due to the refinements made to the base platforming. Mickey is significantly faster in Rebrushed than he is in the original. He jumps higher too, and the movement overall is far crisper, allowing you to snappily rebound from jump to jump in a way that just feels good to control. They've also expanded Mickey's repertoire of moves to give you more options during platforming and combat. In addition to his spin move now carrying some horizontal momentum, allowing it to extend jumps, Mickey can now also dash, sprint, and butt slam, giving you a lot more ways to react to the challenges thrust upon you. And you'll have plenty to do with those new controls as well, as Rebrushed also fleshes out the content of Epic Mickey in some smart ways. They've added a bunch of extra pins to collect and tripled the amount of concept art to find, with all that new stuff hidden both in nooks and crannies where there was nothing previously, as well as in some new little offshoots added in places that previously felt a bit barren. To that same end, they've also doubled the amount of film reels, adding an extra one to each 2D level, with those levels all being expanded to accommodate them, and in some cases being wholly redone to be more engaging and feel more intentionally designed. The worry with that, though, is that making those 2D levels longer would only exacerbate the issues with backtracking, as going through the ones between the hub areas and Mean Street would just take longer, but they thought of that as well. Now, for any 2D level you've already played, you can spend a measly 10 e-tickets to skip past it, which is a godsend when you're banging out side quests in the back half of the game. But if you do want to replay those levels, well, now you have more options as well, because where in the original, a missed reel often necessitated a full second playthrough, as the majority of those 2D stages were one and done, in Rebrushed, now you can take them on at any time via the cinema. Rebrushed overall is just packed with little quality of life changes like this that make the experience so much more enjoyable. The more annoying puzzles have been rejigged, the economy has been rebalanced, though there's still not really all that much to buy, and the level design has been lightly tweaked to flow better all the way through to the final stages. And this fleshing out does impact the visuals as well, though this is where things start to get a bit for better and for worse. That's not to say Rebrushed looks bad, far from it. The overall fidelity of the reimagined visuals is beautifully done, but it does make a number of changes and feels like it has its own tone separate from the original. On the positive side, Rebrushed fills in a lot of what felt like unintentional gaps where tech or time limited things on the Wii. For example, there's lots of side rooms and alcoves in the original that, well, they perhaps hit a collectible, otherwise had no flair to them, no implicit reason for existing. In Rebrushed, they're reimagined as storage spaces and the like, dressed up with props and posters to give those spaces more implied purpose. But that filling in of gaps, along with a more saturated palette and a fantastical take on a lot of the art design, does take away from the decrepit and lonely feel that the original had. In Rebrushed, the stuff that's supposed to look twisted or broken feels like it's supposed to look that way, like it's part of the design, which I suppose it is, whereas the harsher angles and faded colors of the original gave a stronger impression of things degrading to that point. That sense of something once wonderful, woefully falling into depression and disrepair. This even impacts environmental storytelling at points, with one very notable example being Hortensia's house in OsTown. Once you've restored Goofy, he'll unlock the door for you, and in the original, when you head inside, you'll find several bunny children there softly weeping for the loss of their mother. It's somber and sad, and a blunt reminder of what the underlying tone of the story here actually is. Something that is really important heading into those final chapters, where Mickey's guilt and Oswald's grief are key elements. In Rebrushed, however, they're gone. Instead, the room is just silent, except for Hortensia's locket, which you can then either return to Oswald or sell at the museum, gaining some respective morality points, which reduces this moment to just its mechanics. Another place where Rebrushed falls flat in a similar way is in Walt's apartment. It's something you really have to work up to, and in the original when you get there, the room has a quiet dignity to it. Sunlight is dappling in through the window, adding a soft glow to the space, which is itself adorned with old furniture and a shelf full of nostalgic knickknacks. It has a very out-of-place warmth and comfort to it that nowhere else in the Wasteland shares. And mechanically all you'll find in this apartment is a few e-tickets and a single piece of concept art. The only piece in the gallery, mind you, not drawn by the team at Junction Point. Rather, it's an extremely rare sketch of Mickey and Oswald together that was drawn by Walt and included with a note he sent to the head of Universal back in 1935. When you go to the gallery afterwards, it's the first piece you see, and its inclusion really hammers home that theme of their brotherhood, making things feel that much more heartfelt. Rebrushed, on the other hand, still has Walt's apartment unlocked in the same way, but it just doesn't feel the same. That window from which the sun was shining is now an alternate entrance to the room, presumably to be congruous with the fact that you enter via the balcony. But accordingly, the sun now doesn't shine in. That window is left as gloomy as the wasteland outside, the room now lit by a standing lamp, with the whole space feeling more cartoony and like it's part of the wasteland and not something beyond it. The original rendition feels like it intentionally sits outside of the rest of the game, offering this sense of quiet warmth and feeling truly special, which Rebrushed version just doesn't. Even that bit of concept art, while it is still here as well, is presented in a way that saps from its meaning, as it's now included as part of a collage with bits of concept art from the original game. And on that note, all of the rest of the concept art in the gallery is that of Rebrushed instead of the original Epic Mickey, which, given the game's history with concept art, feels like a bit of a waste not to include more from Junction Point there, and instead to focus more or less wholly on Purple Lamp's work. While that and the rest of my issues here are ultimately minor things, and I will still reiterate that I think overall Rebrushed is a fantastic remake, and genuinely far more fun to play than the original version on the Wii, those slight changes in content and tone do detract from it somewhat for me. If I had to guess at why it's like that, I'd say it's a question of intent in design. And for what it's worth, I think both versions do succeed in what they set out to do. Rebrushed feels as though it only cares about Epic Mickey specifically, and the goal was to faithfully recreate and reimagine that title and truly help it live up to its potential as an actual game. That's why it's okay with doing things like removing that snippet of Steamboat Willie that plays when you use a TV sketch, because while that's a nice reference, it being there doesn't make the game any more fun to play. Epic Mickey itself, on the other hand, needs that clip in there, because its goal is to be a conflicted love letter to both Mickey Mouse as a character and Disney as a brand, and that original intent is what occasionally feels overwritten and lost in Rebrushed. If it wasn't blindingly obvious from everything I've shown so far, there was a ton of passion for the source material behind Epic Mickey, a lot of which is down to Warren Spector himself having been a massive Disney fan his entire life. And that love really comes through in the final product, but so does the journey the rest of his team would have had over the course of the project, reconciling their own personal relationships with and varying affinity for the House of Mouse. There's a line that catches me from a blog post that Spector put out for his 40th anniversary in the games industry just a couple of years ago, where he's talking about when things were just getting started on Epic Mickey, and one of his senior team members chose to leave the company as it just wasn't the sort of game he wanted to work on. It was an amicable split, with Spector then going on to state the importance of team buy-in, but then he follows it up with this. The rest stuck around because they were Disney fans like me, or felt they could become Disney fans by the end of the project, which everyone did. And that process of becoming a fan of something so ubiquitous like Disney is going to be full of reevaluation. I'm sure many, if not most of the members of that team had childhoods that established at least some familiarity with Mickey's world, in the same way that so many of us did, via a collection of cheap, battered VHS tapes, or old shorts scratchily recorded from TV specials, maybe even a hazily remembered family trip to one of the parks when they were small. Those old memories may have been ones they cherished, or perhaps those sweet moments soured as an adult understanding of Disney as a corporation, or just a misguided desire to cast away childish things took hold as those people grew older. But that spark of childhood wonder never really goes away, even if it's buried deep. And having to work so closely with its genesis can't help but force a little internal dialogue of what that spark still means to a person. While Epic Mickey is not the brutal teardown of the Disney regime I think some people wanted it to be based on that original concept art, it's not a blandly happy-go-lucky take on the Magic Kingdom either. Rather, it's a messy and conflicted love letter to a world of characters that have inspired an immense amount of joy over the decades. And while those good feelings may have then been diminished or tainted by a cynicism or a sense of betrayal that comes as we get older and we let ourselves see such things as mere commercial product, underneath all of that, the joy and what it meant to us remains. That's why Epic Mickey feels like a wider company exercise, whether that was just at Junction Point or perhaps at Disney as well, in rediscovering that joy and trying to understand it and re-embrace it. Now, of course, I'm not so foolish as to see things purely on such an emotionally philosophical level. This is still Disney we're talking about, and all the good vibes in the world can't hide the bloated conglomeration it has become. But those feelings are a major part of this game, and that does make it something special, even if it doesn't always succeed in showcasing those emotions, or even as a game a lot of the time, if we're being completely honest. And that honesty brings us to the awkward part of this conclusion, which is that I have a hard time recommending you actually play Epic Mickey, at least the original version on the Wii. While it has a lot going for it conceptually, and the presentation overall is utterly fantastic, at least for the time and platform, with captivating environment design and a great score, those things can't hide that it's very sloppily constructed narratively, that there's a lot of questionable design decisions, lazy asset reuse, and clunky, kludgy gameplay. While I can absolutely appreciate the thought and ideas behind so much of this game, actually getting through it is a slog, and it has not aged well in the intervening decade and a half. That being said, if you are a massive Disney fanatic, the kind of person who makes a regular pilgrimage to either Anaheim or Orlando, then this is still definitely worth your time, and I do recommend playing the original version, as I think the atmosphere of it is worth experiencing. On the other hand, if you are a lapsed Mouseketeer or were never a member of the club in the first place, this is not worth digging out the old weave for. However, I can and do recommend Rebrushed to anyone interested in Epic Mickey overall, as it cleans up so many of the original's rough edges and is genuinely pleasant to play. If you do a run of that and find yourself a new convert to the Disney faithful, or are just really curious to see how the original feels in comparison, at that point go hunting for a copy. But otherwise, for casual fans and just people looking for a fun platformer, stick with Rebrushed and let the Wii version of Epic Mickey fade off into the wasteland. Well, that's Epic Mickey. By a hair, not the longest review I've done, nor the hardest to write, but definitely the most involved. There was a ton of research that needed to be done for this one. From getting all the details down for Epic Mickey's journey through development, to playing through the remake, which was not on my agenda, but hey, what the hell, to scouring through the various Disney wikis to make sure I had as much of the details about the parks and the company and the characters correct as I could. It was a lot of work. And then, of course, before even pitching this review in that last coming soon video, I had to spend a good chunk of time and money ensuring this review was even doable. That meant getting my hands on a Wii U so I could actually play and record the damn thing. With no HD output, that's hard to do on a Wii proper. And because the channel was making negative money at that point, I had to be creative, by which I mean cheap, buying the console and the gamepad separately and in parts-only condition to then fix and Frankenstein together. Thankfully, that was at least straightforward. The console was just locked out behind parental controls, which is fiddly but solvable, and the gamepad only needed its Bluetooth unit swapped, which is a relatively simple repair as long as you can find a replacement receiver. Then I had to track down a sensor bar and a Wiimote and a nunchuck, trying to avoid cheap repro crap, which is hard as decent condition OG Wii peripherals are surprisingly getting a bit scarce, so it was all something of an ordeal. But I went to the trouble cause I love all of you, and at the end of the day, it was worth it. Because while Epic Mickey may not have been my favorite game to actually play, this has definitely been one of my favorite videos to make so far. Much like the staff who made the game, my fondness for Disney, or at least their legacy, grew over the course of making this video. While I'm still decidedly not a fan of their modern efforts, those Paul Ruddish Mickey shorts excluded, I've always really liked their older works, and that appreciation has only grown as I binged old shorts while drafting this script. Sure, there's a lot there that perhaps hasn't aged all that well from a cultural point of view, but there's still something very special about the House of Mouse's older eras and their impact on animation history. But that's neither here nor there. The focus for this video was on Epic Mickey itself, and not Disney's larger cultural legacy or anything like that. And I think we've covered the game about as thoroughly as one could without also playing through the tie-in marketing flash game, which I did consider, but I didn't have a place in the script for it. Anyways, if you liked the review, then please go do the assorted YouTube things down below. Like, comment, subscribe, hit the bell, hype it, whatever. It all feeds the beast and gets the algorithm to send more people to the channel, so whatever engagement you feel comfortable doing is always deeply appreciated. If instead you want to support the channel more directly, perhaps put some change in my pocket so I don't have to build my next console out of eBay dumpster scraps, then I do also have a Ko-Fi where you can leave a tip or donate monthly to join the fantastic folks on the left there. As for what's next, well, we'll be doing another vote soon to decide that, as we're still well away from that 25k subscriber goal for Dark Sector. That said, I will be making the voting period for that next coming soon tighter than last time, just so I can get cracking on the next video that much faster. Keep an eye out for that in the next 2 to 3 weeks, give or take. Take care of yourselves, be good to one another, and have a good one.